Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Story of Jonah, an Amish Romance by Grace Given. Chapter 1. Jonah Yoder. Sure, I drank beer. All three of us did, Zach sneered and crossed his arms defiantly. Beer is nice. Not everything about the English is bad, Jonah. Jonah shook his head in disgust as he listened to Zach's tales about his latest adventures in town. And according to Zach, he hadn't even told him the best part yet. They were sitting under the big oak tree, near the edge of the Yoder farm. It was Jonah's favorite spot. From here he could look out over the meadows that were part of the farm. Just over the hill was the main barn, its top just visible over the swaying corn. To the right was the pond where they would swim on a hot day after work. It was the place where the forest began. At night, if you were quiet, you could sometimes spot a deer. They would come out of hiding at dusk to quench their thirst. It always filled Jonah with a sense of wonder. But he especially enjoyed this place because of the birds. Jonah, with his sharp blue eyes, loved to watch his feathery friends on their majestic flight. In summer, swallows gracefully glided over the fields, and later in the year he would marvel at the wild geese that were searching their way through the heavens. He would imagine what it would be like to join them in their flight, or to dive on silvery wings into a mass of puffy white clouds, and then to ascend into the realm of God. God's wonderful creation held a fascination for Jonah. He loved nothing better than to communicate with the God of wonders in silent contemplation. But today there was no room for such reveries. Zach coughed. Here's the best part. You know what I did? Jonah raised his eyebrows. No. What did you do? I kissed Mandy. Zach lowered his voice and spoke the words slowly and deliberately. You kissed Mandy? Jonah narrowed his eyes. That Englisher girl who broke Eli Bender's heart last year? Yes, she's the one. A celestial smile slid over Zach's face as he thought of the precious moment. I never kissed a girl before in my life. She was the first one, and he leaned forward to Jonah. I think she really likes me. Jonah glanced up. Mandy spells trouble, Zach. She's Bermlick. She doesn't just like you. She likes everybody. Zach looked at Jonah and grinned. Barmleach. How would you know, Jonah? You've never even spoken to her, let alone kissed her. Jonah stiffened. I don't have to, Zach. I've heard plenty of stories. Zach wrinkled his nose. Stories. That's what they are, Jonah. He cracked his knuckles and then pointed his index finger at Jonah. What's wrong with you anyway? You sound like stuffy old Abram Hirschberger. I don't want to end up like him. I am young and alive, Jonah. He opened his hands in an inviting gesture. Come with us next Saturday. Just break away for once and see for yourself. It will do you good. He pulled on his suspenders and stretched them out. It will widen your horizons, Jonah. Besides, the Ordnung gives us the right to do so. That's why we have Rumspringa. But when Jonah didn't respond, Zach stared for a moment and let out a sigh. You're a funny fellow, Jonah Yoder. I don't understand you. And I don't understand you, Jonah fired back. Why do I have to drink beer and kiss Mandy McAfee and do all kinds of schmunzia in order to know my place in life. I already know my place in life. I already know my place. I believe in God and see no reason to waste my time doing stuff I don't like." "Suit yourself," snorted Zach while he got up. "But don't come later crying and whining on my shoulders about lost opportunities. What you need is Rumspringa." Jonah gave him a faint smile. "Don't worry, Zach. I won't be knocking on your door." Zach turned around one last time and smirked. "And you're wrong about Mandy. She really likes me, Jonah. She really does." He stared for a moment longer at Jonah and then turned around. Jonah watched him as he walked away and disappeared behind some trees. Jonah sighed and picked up a pebble. Why was it so hard for his friends to understand that he already knew what he wanted to do with his life? He was Amish and had no desire for the world. He loved Gott and the Ordnung. His father was the bishop, and it was well understood that he, Jonah, would eventually take his father's place. That was how it was supposed to be. That was God's way. In 2 weeks, he would be baptized into the church. Let his friends run around all they wanted. It didn't satisfy him. He shook his head again, drinking beer, kissing Mandy McAfee. Imagine. Back at the farm, a bell rang. It shook him out of his thoughts, and he looked up. The sun was already starting to sink behind the distant hills, and he felt his tummy growling. That's right, it's dinner time. Jonah picked up his hat, slapped it over his honey-blonde curls, and got up. In 2 weeks' time, he would be baptized. He would be an official member of the Amish community, and his friends would no longer pester him with their tales of so-called freedom. In 2 weeks, he could really start his life's mission, and he could hardly wait. Chapter 2. The Dream. She looked at him with pleading eyes and whispered his name with a choking voice. "Jonah, Jonah." Jonah's throat was dry, and he squinted his eyes. He wanted to speak, but no words came. Who was this girl? She was about the same age as he. Her long, wavy, chestnut-colored hair hung just over her sagging shoulders, and her cheeks were pale. Why was she staring at him with these big green eyes that seemed to hold a story of misery and pain? She had been crying, and Jonah desperately wanted to hold her and comfort her. He wanted to tell her everything would be all right, but he couldn't move. She wasn't Amish. Or was she? It was hard to tell. She was wearing a long, gray skirt, similar to that of the girls in his community, but her hair was loose. She was not wearing a cap. Her mysterious eyes filled with tears again, and she was holding out her hands for Jonah to take them into hers. She needed help, but why couldn't he move? Then the scene changed, and Jonah found himself floating high above a big city. The girl was gone now, and Jonah seemed to be hanging in space. He wasn't flying. He was just there as an observer. There were no swallows or wild geese, and there was no beauty. He just saw oppressive clouds of yellow smog, and he heard the loud clanging sounds of a city in operation. Grinding metal on metal, the honking of car horns, and the screaming of disgruntled people trying to survive in a world of selfishness that Jonah despised from the core of his being. It felt hot and humid. Big drops of sweat formed on Jonah's head, and he wanted nothing more than to move away, but he couldn't. He didn't belong in this place. He belonged to a different world. Then, to his horror, he was being pulled down to the city. No, I don't want to go there, but he had to. There was nothing he could do. It was as if he were being swallowed up in the belly of a dark, confusing beast. He clenched his fists and swung them around to somehow keep from being sucked up. There was a light, too. It was bright and warm, but he couldn't concentrate on it. He had to fight the pull of the darkness. Right then his tongue was loosened and he screamed, "Gott, come to my aid." He was soaked in sweat and his heart was pounding. What a horrible dream that had been. Jonah pulled the bed covers away and slid out of bed. He shook his head in a futile attempt to clear his mind and walked over to the washbowl full of water on a little table near the window. The cold water felt good on his flushed face. It relaxed him even though he was still panting heavily. But it had only been a dream, and dreams have no meaning, right? The moonlight slid in through a crack in the curtains, and Jonah opened them all the way to get a better look. How he loved the tranquility of the farm. He knew every nook and cranny of this place, and it held no secrets or danger. The moon was just peeking above some puffy clouds, and its gentle light spilled off the roofs of the barns into the grass in front of the farm. He sighed. The view was so peaceful, so comforting, and so natural. What a difference was this world of natural beauty compared to that of the Englishers. He was certain that his dream had been about the world outside of their Amish community. It had been about a world full of pressure and confusion, and that was not his world. But who was that girl? His knees weakened as he thought of her again. She had looked so fragile and broken, and when she called out to him, it had broken his heart. He had wanted to put his arms around her and hold her close. He had wanted to protect her from whatever it was that she was so afraid of. But before he had been able to do so, he had been transported to that ugly city with the yellow smog. He shook his head. Was that girl maybe a symbol? Did she represent some of the lost people in the world who were striving for happiness without God? The Englishers didn't seem to understand that their ungodly lifestyle didn't bring them happiness. Why did they not care about God and His rules? How could they live like that? But what did that have to do with him? Jonah didn't understand it at all. It was already getting toward morning. He could see the first signs of the approaching dawn. Thank you, Gott, that it's almost morning. The day would help him forget his dream. In the daylight, negative thoughts always melted away much easier than in the darkness of the night. The day would bring solace. Jonah opened the window and breathed in the cool air. Then he yawned. Maybe he could still get a little sleep before Father would wake him up. He closed the window again and stepped back into his bed. But the dream kept lingering in his mind, and he kept tossing and turning. And when he finally did fall asleep, his father was soon banging on his door, and it was time to get up. Come on, Jonah, wake up. It's time for the morning chores. Already, Jonah rubbed his eyes and grunted. He wished for once he could turn around and forget about the chores, but he knew that just wasn't done. Reluctantly, he climbed out of bed and slid into his coveralls. Today, as every day, was going to be busy, and he had no time to worry about smog-filled cities and girls without caps that needed his help. Jonah had expected the dream to fade out of his memory. The hard work on the field would take care of that. All those strong emotions would melt as ice on a hot day and leave no more trace. But they didn't. He usually loved working on the fields. He took great pride in making sure the harvest would be plentiful and rich. Each individual plant would receive tender, loving care. But today his mind wasn't on the work, as he mechanically fulfilled his duties without as much as a second thought. He had not expected the impact of his dream to be so great. Bits and pieces of the dream kept playing over and over again in his mind like a swarm of annoying wasps during an outside meal. And what was worse, Jonah realized that it wasn't even just the dream. It was more. Although he assumed the dream wasn't real, it had opened a door to a place he had never before realized existed. He felt burdened about people outside of the Amish community. Of course, he knew about the Englishers and their selfish lifestyle. It was clear that their world did not offer any hope or answers. But the more he thought about it, the more he wondered about the role he was supposed to play in the grand scheme of life. Life for him, up till this point, had been easy and his philosophy simple. You work hard. You do your best. You stay far away from the Englishers and the bad, wicked world, and you obey the Ordnung and God. Happiness would then be your reward, and God would smile at you. But was that really the whole truth? The world outside their small community was so vast and so big, and there were people, like the girl in the dream, that were lost, hopeless, and desperate. What about them? God surely loved them too. What did he, Jonah Yoder, actually know about the pain and the hardships that people had to go through in such a hardened and selfish world? Did he know how to weather the storms of life and help people through them? Was it right for him to just close the door to the world outside their community and live in his own sheltered corner where only beauty and peace were allowed to enter? He had always assumed that this was the way to go. He had never questioned it. After all, doubts were the messengers of Satan, and no place should ever be given to them. Seeing the pain in the eyes of that girl had profoundly shaken the foundation of his beliefs, and Jonah had no defense. Why did he feel so burdened about her? Would he be able to discuss it with somebody? Who could he talk to? Mr. Hirschberger, maybe. Jonah shook his head. That man would not understand any of it. He already had told Father that Jonah was a dreamer and needed to keep his feet more firmly planted on Amish soil. Zach wouldn't understand it either. That only left Father. Chapter 3. Questions and Doubts. That night Mother had prepared a delicious pot pie, a meat stew with large noodles that was one of Jonah's favorite dishes. When he stepped into the dining room, his 5 younger brothers and sisters were already seated, and Father was impatiently waiting to give thanks. When he had plopped himself down, Father raised his eyebrows and quoted a scripture, but his eyes held a twinkle. "You must be ready at all times, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." Jonah mumbled an apology. "Sorry I am late, Father." "It's all right," said his mother. "Now that we are all here, we can start." "Isa," said Father, which meant everybody can eat. But Jonah wasn't very hungry and listlessly stirred his meat stew with his spoon. Mother knew how fond Jonah was of her pot pie and looked at her son with some concern. "Are you all right, Jonah?" "Sure, ma'am," Jonah answered. "It's just that—" Would he talk with Father and Ma'am about a dream at the table? Not a good place with his brothers and sisters present, but he had to tell them something. I just had a dream." He blushed and quickly scooped a spoonful of stew into his mouth. "A dream." Father looked up from his plate. "What about—" But before Jonah could answer, his brother Ezekiel, who was 1 year younger and just about to start his Rumspringa, displayed a roguish grin and interrupted. "Look at that. We've got a dreamer in our midst. Maybe your name should be Joseph." He looked at the others and expected everybody to laugh at his joke, but nobody reacted. "Quiet," Father ordered and cast him an angry glance. "Sorry, Father." Father turned back to Jonah. "What was your dream about?" Jonah shrugged his shoulders. It's really nothing, Father. We don't need to discuss it at the dinner table." "I dream a lot, too," piped up little Ruth. "With her 6 years, she was the youngest in the family. Can I tell my dreams, ma'am?" Mother smiled. "Sure, Ruth. But now is not the best time. Maybe later." "That's right," said Father as he winked at his wife. "Dreams are best not discussed at the table." "We can talk about it after dinner, maybe," Jonah ventured. Father nodded. "Sure, son. I'll be happy to. We can sit outside on the bench." That cheered Jonah up. He took a big bite of his meat stew and realized he really was very hungry. He even broke into a smile. "It's very good, Mom, as usual." "Glad you think so, Jonah," answered his mother, as she smiled back. After dinner, Jonah and his father were sitting on the bench in front of the Yoder's farm overlooking the fields. In the distance, they could hear a cuckoo. It comforted Jonah. Birds had always been his friends, and as long as they were around, Jonah knew that all things would work out just fine. Father was quietly taking in the beauty that lay before them. Then he turned to Jonah and looked at him with gentle eyes. "God is very gut to give us such beauty, isn't he?" Jonah nodded. If there was one thing he had inherited from his father, it was his deep love for nature. Father plucked at his beard and finally broached the subject. "So, you had a dream." Jonah sucked in his cheeks and nodded. Sitting here in this peaceful place, his dream and his related questions seemed almost irrelevant. "Father, did you ever have doubts?" His father narrowed his eyes. Doubts? The bishop peered at his oldest son. He had been the bishop now for many years and was widely respected because of his gentle wisdom and his apparent ability to uphold the strict rules of the Amish in a compassionate way. "Are you having doubts about the Amish way of life, son?" Jonah shook his head. "No, Father, it's not that at all." "Gut," mumbled his father. "After all, you're going to be baptized in 2 weeks' time. So tell me what's on your mind." Jonah blinked as he guided his thoughts back to his dream. "I had this dream. There was a girl in it. She was reaching out to me and calling my name. I am not sure if she was Amish, as she was Amish, as she was not wearing her hair in the proper way. But I felt drawn to her and wanted to protect her. Her eyes were so desperate, and I so much wanted to hold her. But before I could do anything, I was transported to a big, dirty city full of noise, and it was so hässlich. I was pulled into it. There was some kind of light, and then I woke up all sweaty." Father was still plucking his beard. "What do you think it means?" Jonah shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe it was nothing. But the emotions were so real. I can still feel them at this very moment." "Well," Father said, "the part about the big, bad city I get. The way the Englishers is certainly hässlich, and it's not leading anywhere worthwhile. But the girl lay. He hesitated for a moment. "I don't know. And she wasn't Amish." Jonah pressed his lips together. "I don't know. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. But that's actually not so much the point." "Oh." Jonah looked at his father. The girl was so desperate. And for the first time, it made me realize that many people outside our community are lost and are desperately looking for answers. Jonah fumbled with one of the buttons of his shirt and then looked up into the familiar face of his father. "We are living a pretty sheltered life, Father." Father raised his eyebrows. "And we've got answers," Jonah went on. "We've got Gott, but we don't share these answers with anybody." Jonah thought for a moment and then said, "I felt the way the Good Samaritan must have felt on the road to Jericho." Father shook his head. It's true that God is for everybody, son. But the Englishers aren't looking for him. It's everyone's personal responsibility to find Gott and obey him. But what if it is in our power to help? Isn't that what the story of the Good Samaritan is all about? Sure, agreed Father. Do good if you can, but you don't have to go looking for problems. That's not the Amish way. Jonah let out a deep sigh. I love the Amish way. I believe it's the right way. But I don't understand it all. Many Englishers are good people, and some of them are looking for God. Am I not supposed to help them? Father rubbed his nose and thought for some time. I don't know, son. I'm not sure if it's our responsibility to worry about unbelieving people outside of our community. They can reach out to God if they want. But what if they can't? Interrupted Jonah. Jonah's father eyed his son. You sound like a missionary, son. A missionary? Father smiled. Well, yes. A missionary is somebody who wants to spread the good news out of love for his fellow men. Jonah shook his head. I don't think I am a missionary, Father. For starters, I would never want to leave the farm and go to the city. Still, Jonah searched for words. This dream made me think of things I never thought of before. I am confused about it. How can I live peacefully here and yet feel so burdened about people like that girl? We are a witness to the truth, son. Our way of life and the way we dress. All of that is a witness to an unbelieving world. But we shouldn't carry burdens that were specifically commissioned by Christ to the 12 disciples. That could lead to pride and hashmut. Jonah nodded. He knew that was the official interpretation of the Ordnung, but it didn't satisfy him. The Bible tells us to work out our own salvation in fear and trembling. Father continued, we are not called to go out and help the Englishers in that way. But tell me, did you always feel this way? Jonah shrugged his shoulders. I am not sure, Father. I just never asked myself these questions before, and I don't know how to answer them. For a moment, they were silent. The sun was down now, but the afterglow of the sunset was still lingering in the sky and cast her celestial colors over the land. Look at the sky, Jonah. Father broke the silence. What we have is very beautiful. Jonah nodded. It sure is, Father. The cities of the Englishers are a real curse, Jonah. Jonah looked up. I know, Father. Why do you say that? His father placed his hand on Jonah's knee for a moment and sighed. Because if you really believe you are supposed to help the Englishers in the way you are talking about, you can't do it here. Then you would have to go to the big city. A shiver went through Jonah's body. Living among the English. I already told you I don't want to do that. Never. Jonah looked wide-eyed at his father. I don't want to leave the Amish, Father. I don't want to leave the Amish, Father. The city in my dream was absolutely Heslick. Besides, it was only a dream. Gott, Father answered with a nod. Then it's all settled. Jonah agreed. That's right, Father. The city could never be God's will. It's just that I feel. Well, maybe there's more we can do. But not in the city, never in the city. Father smiled. Well, the Englishers have a saying that is quite true. They say, you can't have your cake and eat it too. In other words, you can't have it both ways. Jonah responded with a short nod. You are right, Father. I know our way of life is right and that we live a charmed life. It was just that stupid dream. Father looked at the house. If I smell correct, I think Mom has some rhubarb punch ready for us. You want some? Jonah's eyes lit up. Sure. Rhubarb punch was his favorite. The conversation was over. Jonah agreed with his father. Everything he had said was true, but that heavy feeling on his chest was still there. Somehow, he had no peace. Just as he stepped inside the house, that picture of the girl forced its way into the forefront of his mind again. Jonah. Jonah. He heard the words as clearly as if someone had spoken them to his ear. Chapter 4. Jonah's Departure. That night, Jonah kept moving around in his bed. He just couldn't find a comfortable position to sleep. When he was lying on his right side, he felt the need to lie on the left, and when he turned to the left, he needed to be on the right. It was schrecklich. At least he had no dreams, but he almost wished he had. In 2 weeks' time, he was going to be baptized. Actually, 2 weeks, minus 2 days. It wasn't that Jonah had any doubts about his baptism, but the dream had opened a place in his heart that he never knew existed, and it contained a world of questions that demanded answers, and he wanted them answered before baptism. After all, these questions could not be properly answered after his baptism. At least not if he wanted to be a member in good standing in the community. Then it hit Jonah. Maybe he needed to postpone his baptism and make better use of his Rumspringa. Wasn't he entitled to a period of freedom? If he postponed his baptism, he could better deal with his doubts. Doubts. That sounded bad. He had no doubts about serving God. But the talk with his father had not really answered any of his concerns. Of course, he didn't want to join Zach and the others in their shallow foolishness either. Maybe it would be best to travel away from the community for some time. He got up and sat on his bed while he rubbed his hands through his hair. Then a thought hit him. Go to the city. The thought was strong and demanding. What? Where did that horrible thought come from? Get thee behind me, Satan. Jonah tried to push the thought out of his mind, but somehow it lingered and made him shiver. This wasn't going right. He needed to pray. Jonah knelt in front of his bed and sought the help of his heavenly Father. God, I need you so much. I'm so confused. I had this strange dream, and I don't understand it. I want nothing more than to serve you. I am about to be baptized, but maybe I need more time to find out what it is that you want from my life. I feel I need some time away from the community in order to find your will. Should I do that? Gott? And where would I go? I am not going to the wicked city, Gott. You don't have to worry about that, but I need you to guide me. It is expected of me to eventually take my father's place as the bishop. But in order to do that, I need to understand my place in your kingdom first. Please help me, God. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Jonah looked up from his prayer. A sense of peace enveloped him. He marveled at the beauty of faith. How precious, how priceless. To unburden your heart through prayer and to truly hold on to the arms of the Savior. Even though he did not know what the next step was supposed to be, he felt true peace. Last Sunday, during the service, they had talked about the peace of God that passes all understanding. They must have been talking about the very thing he felt just now. He lifted his eyes and glanced out the window. The fields were partly illuminated by the moonlight. How he loved this country. How wonderful life on the farm was. Father was right about how blessed they were. But he would have to leave it for some time. He couldn't really find the answers here. He needed to leave in order to be truly ready for baptism. Jonah walked back to the bed, plopped himself down, and stared at his feet. Where would those feet lead him? Wasn't there a scripture passage about feet? Your word is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path. Thank you, Gott. The Bible always brought clarity. It wasn't hard at all. He just needed to follow Gott. That was the way to go. He opened the covers and climbed back into bed. Tomorrow he would ask his father if he could postpone the baptism and if he would know of a place where he could travel to. And that wasn't going to be the big city. At least that was one thing he could be certain of. As soon as he closed his eyes, he drifted off to sleep. Yes, we can postpone your baptism. Father blew on his hot maple chocolate that Mother had placed in front of them and slowly nodded. And you're sure you want to spend some time away from our community? Yes, answered Jonah. He readjusted his hat. He had feared this conversation. After our talk last night, I feel that's what I need to do. It's important to me. Father looked troubled. Jonah knew his remark was hard on his father, but he knew him well enough to know that he would support him as much as he could. Where do you want to go? I have been thinking about it, Jonah said while he leaned back in his chair. It seemed Father understood. Do we have any relatives? Where I would be welcome? Father thought for a while and plucked his beard as was his custom, when he had no direct answer. But then his eyes lit up. You could go to Aaron and Elizabeth Byler. He took a sip of his chocolate milk with a pleased expression. It's quite a journey since they live on the other side of the country, but they may have a place for you, and they are good people. That sounds gut. We'll have to write them, and that may take a little while. Then his face darkened. But, you don't want to go to a community near, for example, Los Angeles? Jonah was just taking a sip of his hot chocolate milk and choked. Los Angeles? No way, Father. Father smiled. No problem, son. Just making sure. After our talk last night, I expected this conversation. But, he said with a sigh, I almost feared you foolishly would have wanted to go to the big city. Jonah shook his head with such vigor that he almost spilled his hot drink on the crisp blue shirt he was wearing that day. No, Father, I told you. I don't want to go near Los Angeles. Father was convinced. Gut's son. I'll write to Aaron Byler today. Jonah felt his muscles relax. All things would work out, and as he looked up from his drink, he smiled. Visiting Aaron and Elizabeth Byler sounds wonderful. All right, said Father. Then it will be the Bylers, provided they have room. And so it happened that Jonah stepped on the train 3 weeks later to journey to the other side of the country. He had never been on a train before and felt butterflies in his stomach. He realized for the first time that saying goodbye wasn't all that easy. I'll be back, Jonah said with a forced grin after he had said his goodbyes. His mother kissed him gently on both cheeks, and Father still quoted some scripture. Remember, son, the words of our Lord, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Thanks, Father. Jonah nodded and boarded the train. When he had found a place to sit and opened the window, he waved with a confidence that he didn't feel. His little sister Ruth was even crying, but then to his relief, the train started to move. Zach, too, had come to see him off, and he still ran alongside the moving train, wildly waving his hat. Told you Rumspringa would be gut for you. Jonah could hardly hear him over the noise of the departing train, but Zach kept on screaming at the top of his lungs. And be sure to kiss all the girls there in my name. Jonah smiled and shook his head. No, Zach. It's not my mission to kiss a girl. I am on God's mission. When the train had left the station, He sat down and stared out the window. He recognized the Zook's farm, and soon they passed by the woods he had explored with Father when he had been young. But before he knew it, he did not recognize anything anymore. He was now in unfamiliar territory. Here he had never been before. Now, God would truly have to guide his feet. Chapter 5. Nothing to fear. In time, you'll get better, Jonah. The young Amish woman was gently dabbing Jonah's forehead with a cool washcloth. A concerned look flashed over her face as she looked at the young man who had been sick for over a week. She had a sparkling smile, and her face radiated a fresh innocence that was so common among the Amish women. Her blonde hair was braided and tucked away under her neatly starched cap. She dropped the washcloth in a washing bowl near the bed and smiled. Your stay here hasn't been very blessed yet. Her presence warmed Jonah's heart. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for taking care of me. Jonah tried to move. Can you help me sit up? I think I am getting better. Sure. Grace propped up the pillow and pulled Jonah up under his armpits so he could lean against the bedpost. From the moment Jonah had stepped inside the house of Aaron and Elizabeth Byler, he had taken a special liking toward their daughter Grace. She had actually been the only good thing since his arrival at the Byler's farm almost 3 weeks ago, for, so far, his stay at the Byler's had been the most miserable time of his life. Already upon his arrival, he had sprained his ankle. After Aaron Byler had picked him up from the train station and had driven them to the farm, he had jumped off the buggy in an effort to impress the beautiful young Amish woman that was standing near the open door. But he had landed wrong and unceremoniously dropped to the ground with a scream. The Amish girl yelped and ran over to help him up, but he was in great pain. His foot had swollen immediately to twice its normal size, and although the young woman had helped him into the house, the pain he felt far surpassed the joy of leaning on her arm. That had been his introduction to Grace, the oldest daughter of Aaron and Elizabeth Byler. She had lowered him onto a chair and brought in a footstool to rest his sore foot on. And so he had sat there for the next 3 days, doing nothing. It had been hard on him. He wanted to be productive, and just sitting down and suffering in pain with a bunch of history books to read wasn't his idea of being a blessing. But finally, on the 4th day, his ankle was declared healed, and Jonah immediately volunteered his help in repainting the walls of the kitchen with milk paint. He knew how to paint and prided himself on being a good worker, and generally he was, but this time his paint job ended in disaster. Whether he had been overly confident or it just had been a case of bad luck, he couldn't tell, but he had dropped an entire can of paint on the wooden floor of the kitchen. He wasn't entirely to blame since the handle of the bucket of paint had unexpectedly broken off, but admittedly Jonah should not have swung the can around the way he had done. The next 2 days he had been busy fixing up the entire kitchen floor. And then he had gotten sick with the flu. High fevers, cold and hot spells, and pain in all his joints and ligaments. The dizzy spells were so severe he felt like a rat on a storm. Tossed ship. Grace had served as his personal nurse. Her name fit her well, Jonah had decided. She was graceful in all she did, and her smile would possibly even brighten up the mood of someone like Abram Hirschberger. And now, Jonas felt he wanted to talk to her about his confused feelings. This girl would understand. Can we talk about something, Grace? He asked, while he rested against the propped-up pillow in his bed. Sure. Grace sat down near the bed and dropped her hands in her lap. Tell me. And so, he told Grace his dream. He told her about his confusion. He told her about some of his doubts, and he even talked about Zach and Mandy McAfee. But he especially told her about the girl with the pleading eyes and about the emotions he had felt when he saw her. When he was done, he looked at her. "What do you think, Grace?" Her hazel brown eyes seemed soft as she considered what he had just told her. Then she turned to Jonah, and her gaze held a serious expression. "What I think doesn't really matter much, Jonah. I suppose what really matters is what God thinks. But let me ask you a question. Why did you come here in the first place?" Well, Jonah had not expected that question. "I came to find out where in God's place I fit in. I love the Amish, but I don't understand my concern for people outside of the community." Grace blinked. "People outside of the community?" "Yes, that's what I told you." "But you are in the community here," Grace answered calmly. "So maybe you are in the wrong place here." The wrong place. Jonah veered up, only to realize that he was still very weak from his sickness, and he fell back on his pillow. Where then should I go? Precisely where people outside our community live. They live outside our community. Huh. Jonah's eyes widened. Then he realized what Grace was saying and sighed deeply. "You can't be serious. Are you telling me I should move out of the community and live among the Englishers?" "I am not saying anything," Grace retorted. "What I'm saying is that you need to ask God what it is that He wants you to do. And whatever God tells you will give you peace and answers. Nothing else will." "I had peace when I came here," Jonah lied. "I am happy you did. And I am the last one to tell you that you should not be here. But your stay here has only brought you misery, and you yourself are talking about your concern for people outside the community. That makes me think you need to talk to God about that." "Fine," Jonah sulked. "But I won't go to the city. I can't go there. I won't do it." He gritted his teeth in a stubborn fashion and pulled up the covers all the way to his neck. "Don't worry, Jonah," Grace said, while she held up her hand in an apologetic fashion. "Just talk to God about it. And don't be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God." Jonah narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Grace in soft tones, "that you never have to be afraid of what God is doing. He is capable of keeping you safe, anywhere on this planet. If we truly commit our lives to God, we have nothing to fear. The famous missionary Dr. David Livingstone said once, "The heart of dark Africa within the will of God is the safest place on earth. But the throne of England outside the will of God is the most dangerous place you can be." Jonah considered what Grace had said. "It sounds beautiful." "Yes," Grace said warmly, "but it's not just beautiful. It's true." Then she leaned over the bed and touched Jonah's cheeks. "I think your fever is gone. Maybe tomorrow we can still get some real work out of you, and we can talk some more." Then she smiled and got up. When the door closed behind her and Jonah was left in the quiet of the bedroom, he marveled and wished he had seen her face in the dream instead of that of the lost girl. Chapter 6. The Belly of the Whale. The moonlight was casting ghostly shadows on the dirt path before him. Jonah had to be careful where he placed his feet. At several places he spotted some gnarled tree roots sticking out of the ground, and he had experienced enough trouble to last him a lifetime since his arrival at the Bylers. Another sprained ankle was not part of the plan. What was part of the plan was a heartfelt talk with God. His conversation with Grace had shaken him up. "You need to talk to God about everything," she had said, and she was right. The last time he poured out his heart to God, it had been the night after his dream. and it had given him great peace. He also realized that he had lacked the courage to ask God the difficult questions that night, and neither had he waited long enough to really hear God speak. But tonight, it would be different. Tonight, he wanted to get down to business with the Father. Grace had told him about a beautiful field nearby where she would often go to seek God, and on this beautiful night, as the moon was soaking the world in its heavenly light, he was determined to find that spot and unite with the King of Kings. He had not told the Bylers he was going out. Why would he? He had been cooped up in the house long enough, and he would be back in an hour or so. If only he could find the place Grace had so passionately told him about. You follow the dirt path behind our house for about half a mile, and then you come to a huge oak tree. There you go off the path, into the forest, and after about 40 or 50 yards, you are there. It's the most amazing view of the valley. She would have shown him if she could have, but since he had been bedridden almost the whole time at their farm, she never yet had the chance. Jonah shook his head. Grace had even openly wondered about his misfortune. Granted, these weeks had been rather unpleasant. But no more. Now life was about to take a turn for the better. He had carefully followed Grace's instructions. But wherever he looked, he saw no oak tree. Of course, he could pray here too. He just had to close his eyes and he could talk to God anywhere. But then he scolded himself. No, I am not giving up so easily. Grace had said that the very place itself lifted her to the heavens, and that's what he needed. Then he spotted an oak tree. It didn't look as big as he had imagined, but it had to be the right tree. It was the only oak he had seen. He moved away from the path and stepped inside the forest. He smelled moss and bark, and he inhaled the scent deeply. This place was wonderful. It was just so hard to see since the moon barely lit up the ground before him. He took another step, then another, and then he screamed. The ground gave way under his feet. There was nothing to hold on to. What was happening? Jonah clawed with his hands into the thin air, trying to get hold of something. Anything. Something scratched his face, and before he realized what was happening, he hit the ground with a thud. For a moment, he lay dazed on the ground, trying to get his bearings. His mouth was full of earth, and he coughed and spat it out. Was that blood? He felt a trickle of blood on his forehead. He touched it. He had a deep gash. But it didn't appear he had broken anything. Or had he? His ankle, the same ankle he had sprained 2 weeks earlier, was hurting again. Oh, God! How did I get myself in this mess? He scrambled to his knees as best as he could and investigated his new surroundings. It appeared he had fallen into some sort of narrow pit. And it was deep too, maybe 5 or 6 yards. In any case, way too deep to just climb out. The walls were steep, and at first glance it didn't appear there were any sturdy footholds he could use. It smelled musty and rotten, and it was dark, so very dark. Far above him he could see some overhanging branches and the pale light of the moon. It was altogether a discouraging sight. He glanced up to see if he could climb out. So much for my desire to pray. But praying was the only thing he could do. Tomorrow the Bylers would certainly find him. At least that was a comfort. Jonah sighed and looked up again. His warm, comfortable bed and Grace's smile seemed as far away as the moon above. Then he shuddered. The image of the girl with the pleading eyes worked itself into his mind again. It was still so vivid and clear. No, God, I've got enough. Jonah. Jonah. Never had Jonah felt so low and so deserted, and he could not hold back the tears anymore. "Oh, God, I am just so lost. What's happening to me? I want to serve you, but instead of things getting any better, they only get worse." Then the tears came, and he cried and cried until he dozed off into a fitful sleep. But the next day, the Bylers didn't find him. Jonah screamed his lungs out, but nobody answered. He was utterly alone and completely forsaken. At first he was angry with God and yelled out his frustration. "I am your servant. I have given my all to you. Why am I going through all this misery, and why don't you help me?" It felt good to yell at God. It somehow cleared the air. Jonah remembered how someone had once told him to always be honest with God, that God could take it and wouldn't fall apart if one of his children was mad. After all, God already knew what was in the heart of man anyway. And it was true. After he had poured out his anger, Jonah felt strangely comforted. He did not understand it, but he somehow sensed that God knew he was there, and if God knew, then everything was in his hands, however it would all play out. Of course, it didn't make any sense. Nothing did, but a conviction of peace, however small, trickled through the darkness of his trials. Most men in the Bible had suffered. Job had, and what about the Master himself? After the unbelievers had hammered those rusty nails in Jesus' hands and feet, on that cruel cross, and Jesus had died, he had spent 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth. Considering the trials of the Savior, he wasn't that bad off. On the second day, Jonah decided the only thing to do was to worship God. He realized with great clarity that the human heart was generally quick to blame God for anything bad in life, but was seldom willing to offer praise and honor for all the good. Wasn't that the essence of faith, to trust and believe in the midst of darkness? Arguing with God wouldn't help anyway. His ankle was badly swollen again, but at least the gash in his forehead had stopped bleeding. And so, he sang. He sang all the hymns he could remember, and at times he forgot the horrible predicament he was in. At those moments, it seemed his pit became a temple. At several intervals, he yelled out for help, but nobody came. At one point it rained, and although it soaked his clothes and made him shiver, he eagerly sucked up the rainwater to quench his thirst. On the third day, they still hadn't found him. The lack of food made him dizzy. Fasting wasn't a problem for him. He had done that many times, but the circumstances had definitely been better in his days of organized fasting than they were now. Still, it seemed to make him very clear in spirit. He sang a few more hymns, screamed one more time for help, and finally closed his eyes. Then he saw the girl from his dream again. But this time it was different. Was he having some sort of vision? The girl was smiling now. What a beautiful smile it was. The sun was shining on her hair, and she was holding out her arms to him. Her chestnut hair was flowing in the wind, and her green eyes were full of happiness. Then she spoke. "I knew you'd come. I just knew it." She was not pleading this time. She seemed safe and happy. Jonah woke up, back to reality. Was he dying and having some sort of hallucination? He looked at the muddy walls of his pit. No, he was still alive. "Gott, what are you trying to show me?" A scripture passage came to him. "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper, and God spoke. Oh Gott, I love you. You are everything. I am ready to listen, Gott. Then everything around Jonah became deeply silent. Not a sound was heard. Not a twig above him in the forest was moving. Even the wind seemed unable to blow the slightest breeze. What was happening? Was he on holy ground? An enormous gulf of peace swept over Jonah, and he felt as if he was taken up in the hands of love. Here in the midst of deep suffering, Jonah was crying tears of joy. Gott, my Lord and my King. As in a flash of revelation, Jonah saw what God wanted him to do. He was supposed to go to Los Angeles. Why? He could not tell. Only God knew. But that was enough. And what was more, he saw now that God had shown him this step all along. It was crystal clear. Had there not been light in his dream? But he had not wanted to see it. He had rejected it because it was so different from his preconceived ideas of what or who God was supposed to be. It had been too hard to see. But now he knew. There was no more fear. And without the shadow of a doubt, Jonah knew he would be set free. God was going to work a miracle, and he started to sing. When through the woods and forest glades I wander, and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees. When I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, and hear the brook and feel the gentle breeze, then sings my soul, my Savior, God, to thee, how great thou art, how great thou art. Jonah, my Gott, there you are. Jonah immediately recognized Grace's voice, and when he looked up far above in the morning light, he could see her beautiful face looking down at him in alarm. He had no more sense of time or direction, but seeing her face was like seeing the face of an angel. "I'll get Father," she shouted. Her face disappeared again, and Jonah closed his eyes again. "Thank you, Gott. I knew you would do it." Chapter 7. Los Angeles. Dear Father and Ma'am, I am writing this letter to you to let you know I have arrived safely in Los Angeles. I know you are concerned about me staying in the big city, and it is not what you had hoped for. But please rest assured I feel I'm right where I belong at the moment. I am renting a room and have found work in a coffee shop. Please don't worry about me. I am not about to leave the Amish. In fact, I feel this whole experience is making me into a better person, and I believe, as a result, I will be better equipped to serve our community with my whole heart. I just know that God has led me here, and although He has not yet revealed His reasons, I am at peace. Your loving son, Jonah. TFs. There's no rhubarb pie here, ma'am. I miss your cooking terribly. The food here is awful. The Eager Beaver had just opened a month before Jonah arrived in Los Angeles. It was a small coffee shop, but the owners had done their best to create a rustic atmosphere, which was one of the main reasons Jonah had taken the job. The place reminded him of home. The furniture, the wood-carved chairs with their Windsor backs, and the accompanying round Ponderosa tables were handcrafted and made of solid wood, and the floor of exquisite Appalachian hardwood, shone as bright as the best homes among the Amish. The walls were covered with white pine wood and decorated with paintings of rural scenes. When Gilbert, the owner, had interviewed him for the job and heard he was Amish, he had hired him right away and even wanted Jonah to work in his normal Amish clothes. It adds to the authenticity of my place, he smiled Jonah was happy to comply, although he did get quite a few nasty remarks on his way to and from work from city people. Jonah just shrugged his shoulders and tried not to let it get to him. People are afraid of everything they don't understand. Since the Amish are fond coffee lovers, Jonah enjoyed working in the Eager Beaver. Every morning when he showed up for work, he took a moment to inhale the rich scent of the freshly brewed coffee and compared it to the coffee his mother made. Nothing would ever beat Mother's coffee, but this coffee, admittedly, was pretty good, and it became his ritual every day before work to drink a good mug of the black gold and sample a freshly baked donut. Life in Los Angeles was very different, though from the life he was used to. When he would go home at night and the sun was already down, he was used to eating together with the family around the table, sharing stories of the day and maybe still reading a good book for a while. Then it was bedtime. But not here. Here. It seemed the city came alive after dark. Wherever Jonah looked, he saw flashing neon lights that were trying to convince a pleasure, seeking world that happiness and joy were to be found within the very walls of the establishments that carried these lights. He especially hated the constant sound of screeching tires and blaring car horns, the yelling sirens of flashing police cars, and the never-ending stream of people that were seemingly going nowhere. But God had showed him to come here. There had to be a reason, and Jonah refused to question his conviction. Grace had agreed with him. They had prayed together before he left for Los Angeles. "God bless you, Jonah Yoder," she had said in her gentle manner. "I admire your zeal for Gott." He shrugged. "I feel very small and weak, Grace. I wonder if this is how Abraham felt when God told him to leave his known world behind and step out into the unknown." Grace smiled. "Maybe, but Abraham's sample of faith is still the sample we follow today." He had looked into her soft hazel brown eyes. "Thanks for everything, Grace. I'm afraid I can't be too proud about my stay here, and now I am even going to Los Angeles. Of all places, I hope your folks understand." "Don't worry so much, Jonah. All that matters is that you understand." "But I don't," he answered with a small voice. She had smiled. A God that is small enough for our understanding would not be large enough for our needs. Our lives are to be lived by faith, not by sight. That was now over a month ago, and he still didn't know why he was here. But he had to be patient. He couldn't push his own agenda on God. His father had given a sermon a while back about the patience of Jacob. That man of God had worked for 21 years for an unbelieving cheat. Imagine that. 21 years. But Jacob was blessed in the end because he held on to his faith. It seemed that teaching patience was one of God's most frequent lessons to any of his children. Such a hard lesson. That morning, after Jonah had just come in and was about to enjoy his coffee and his daily donut, the door opened and a young woman walked in. At first, Jonah didn't pay much attention to her. After all, his work hadn't yet started, and this was his private time. She sat down at the round table next to him, and Jonah felt her stare. He was accustomed to people staring. That happened all the time in the big city. He took a bite of his donut and tried to ignore her. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft and barely audible. "Excuse me, are you Amish? I mean, for real." "Huh." Jonah looked up and turned just as he took another bite. For a moment, his arm froze in front of his mouth. Then he lowered his donut and wiped the crumbs from his mouth with a startled expression on his face. That girl. He knew her. She was the girl from his dream, the girl with the pleading eyes. She cleared her throat and mumbled apologetically. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you. I just thought, well, that maybe you were Amish because of your clothes. Jonah's eyes had widened, and for a moment he forgot everything around him. She was unmistakably the girl he had seen in his dream. Her face flushed, and she fidgeted with her hands. Her wavy chestnut hair was hanging loosely over her shoulders, just like in the dream, and her eyes. They were even greener than he remembered from his dream. They were the most beautiful green Jonah had ever seen. But even though she was trying very hard to smile, it was clear that these eyes hid a deep sorrow and had shed many a tear. She was slumped in her chair, and her shoulders were drooping. Before Jonah could say anything, she got up again. "Sorry to bother you." But Jonah reached out over the table and touched her arm. "No, please. Don't go. I am really Amish." She looked at him with a puzzled expression. She seemed to consider whether or not she should leave, but to Jonah's relief, she dropped back in her chair. "So you are really Amish?" Jonah nodded. "Yes, I really am, the full 100%. She eyed him with a bit of suspicion. "Then what are you doing here?" "I work here." "Here?" "Yes, in the coffee shop. Can I get you something to drink? Or would you like a donut, maybe?" There appeared a faint smile on her face. "Just a coffee, please." Jonah got up, disappeared behind the bar, and placed a mug under the coffee machine. The owner just stepped out of the office. "Morning, Jonah." "Morning, Mr. Gilbert. I know work is about to begin, but would you mind if I spent a few minutes with that girl over there?" Jonah nodded in the direction of the table. After Gilbert had looked the situation over, there appeared a playful smile on his face. A girl, huh? Amish or not, were all the same. Then he nodded. "Just a few minutes, then. It's early and I can handle it for now." "Thanks, Mr. Gilbert." Jonah served the girl a generous cup of coffee and sat down again. For a while she just sipped at her drink, and Jonah studied her. Then she looked up and smiled, a real smile, and to Jonah it was as if the sun broke through the clouds on a dark, depressing day. "Why are you staring at me like that?" Jonah felt his face redden. "I have seen you before." "You have? Where?" Jonah shuffled with his feet. How could he tell this girl he had dreamed about her, and that she was most likely the very reason he was roaming around this wicked city in the first place? "You look like someone I know," Jonah corrected himself. "Pleased to meet you. My name is Jonah." He extended his hand. She took it in hers. It felt soft and gentle. "My name is Edaline." What a beautiful name. "Thank you." Edaline lowered her eyes. "It means noble, but that name doesn't fit me very well." "Why is that?" Edaline looked up. Her smile was gone again. "Can I ask you a question first?" "Sure, shoot." "What are you, an Amish boy, doing here in Los Angeles? Aren't you supposed to be on the farm, working hard?" Jonah chuckled. "I am here because I felt God wanted me here. I know it sounds crazy, but I am on my Rumspringa. You probably don't know what that is. You see, when—" "I know what Rumspringa is," Edeline interrupted him. "You do?" A big tear rolled out of Edeline's eyes and fell into her coffee. "Yes, I do. I am Amish too. Or at least I was." Jonah fell back in his chair and looked at Edeline wide-eyed. Rumspringa became my downfall, Edaline continued. I made many mistakes. I wish I could undo it all, but I can't. New tears dripped off her face. On impulse, he grabbed Edaline's hand and gently squeezed it. It's all right. Whatever it is, it's all right. Jonah, I need you back here. Gilbert's voice sounded demanding and cut through the moment like an arrow. Can't have girls crying in here. Bad for business. Jonah cast him an angry glance and turned back to Edaline. I need to go back to work. But can we meet again sometime? I'll work till 5. Edaline nodded. I work till 6, but I can see if I can get off early. I'll meet you here at 5. She smiled again and got up. Thanks for the coffee, Jonah. Jonah didn't know what to say in return. The only thing that came was something he didn't want to say, but it slipped out of his mouth anyway, as if it had a will of its own. You are a wonderful girl, Edeline. She blushed. Then she turned and left. Jonah stared dumbfounded at the door and shook his head. Gott, what are you doing? What was that all about? Gilbert's voice penetrated Jonah's reveries. Making customers cry is not part of the deal, Jonah Yoder. It's nothing for you to be worried about, Mr. Gilbert. She used to be Amish. Mr. Gilbert's face took on a puzzled expression. I see. Well, she's gone now, and we've got a business to run. Yes, answered Jonah, while he furrowed his brow. He wanted to say something back, but decided against it. Some things were better not said, for it was clear that he and Mr. Gilbert were not in the same business. When Edaline stepped into the street, her heart pounded in her chest. Meeting that Amish boy had affected her more deeply than she wished to admit. It had opened the door to a world of emotions she thought she had locked safely away. Apparently that wasn't true. Just the sight of that young man had painfully proven how weak she really was. But here on the street, things felt more normal again. The cool morning air relaxed her nerves, and the hustle and bustle of the busy city helped her to see things in perspective. She scolded herself. Why had she agreed so willingly to meet Jonah again? He was even on his Rumspringa in Los Angeles of all places. That couldn't be good. He probably wanted to live it up and see the world. Well, she had seen enough trouble to last her a lifetime. No, she had to be tougher. She couldn't be weak. Not here, not in Los Angeles. As she trudged forward to the bus stop that would take her to her work, she wiped her cheeks and hoped no one would notice she had cried. Men were all the same. They just wanted a pretty girl for a night or two, and then they would drop you like a hot potato. And Amish boys were no different, or were they? Jonah seemed very gentle, the way he had looked at her with his big, dreamy blue eyes. When she first had seen his Amish outfit, her heart had jumped. It felt so safe and secure. A touch of home where the ugly reality of a sin-sick world wasn't so prevalent. Still, she had stepped into something again, without thinking. She always did that. She shook her head. Will I ever learn? Watch out, stupid sea donkey. A rude, mocking voice shook Edaline out of her reverie. She had bumped into a fat young fellow who was walking the sidewalk with swaggering steps. His ragged t-shirt read, I am the king of the mountain, and he smelled like sweat and beer. While he shook his angry face in disdain, his greasy ponytail slapped her cheek. Watch where you're going. Edaline cringed as she sensed his anger and moved past him. Men were all the same. She just had to survive and make the best of it. She would see Jonah tonight, but she would be on guard. Besides, when he saw Christopher, that would probably weed him out real quick. It always did, and she saw no reason why it would be any different with an Amish fellow on his Rumspringa. Chapter 8. At the apartment. To Jonah, the day couldn't go by fast enough. He constantly looked at the big wall clock and counted the minutes. Finally, it was time to leave. "Thanks for your help, Jonah," spoke Gilbert. "And, sorry about this morning." "It's nothing, Mr. Gilbert," Jonah spoke in hurried tones. "It won't happen again." "Not here." "Oh, see you tomorrow?" After Jonah closed the door behind him, he spotted Edaline right away. She was standing near a bus stop and was holding a small kid by the hand. A child? He walked up to her with a huge smile. "Hello, Edaline." Edaline smiled back. "Meet my son, Christopher. He is almost 2. "Hello, Christopher." Jonah squatted down and shook the little fellow's hand. His eyes were sparkling green, like his mother's, but his hair was blonde and curly, almost like his own. Christopher gave him a big crocodile grin and mumbled, "Hello." Edaline studied Jonah while he tousled Christopher's hair. "You like kids?" Jonah looked up with a questioning gaze. "Sure. Why wouldn't I?" When he got up, his eyes had a twinkle. "I love being around kids." Then he reached out and took hold of Christopher's hand. "I am ready. Where shall we go?" "Do you mind coming to my place?" Edaline asked. "It's right close by. I do not usually invite people over that I don't know very well, but since you are Amish, I suppose it's different. Christopher has all his playthings over there. You see—" "Sure, no problem." After a short walk, they came to a busy side street full of apartments, and Edaline stopped in front of an apartment complex with a big green door. "Welcome to our home," Edaline smiled while she fumbled with the key. Her apartment was small and a bit disorganized, with a few books and magazines lying around. A table that could use a coat of paint was placed against the wall near the door where they had entered and was surrounded by 3 rough wooden chairs. On the opposite side was a window that gave a good view of the neighboring apartments and their balconies, full of strings of drying laundry. 2 easy chairs were placed in a semicircle, slightly away from the window and facing a small table with a tiny TV in the corner. On the other side of the window was the kitchen with a stove and a rusted fridge, and another door that led to the only bedroom. The door was open, and Jonah could see Edaline's bed and a low toddler bed for Christopher that stood propped up against it. But the place was clean and smelled fresh, and Jonah loved the many plants that Edaline had placed in the various corners. It was not like home, but she had certainly done the best she could. Edaline picked up Christopher and carried him to the bedroom. "Just need to change his stinky diaper. Then I'll fix us something to eat. Would you like pot pie?" "It is ready. I just need to heat it up." Did you say pot pie? Jonah had always heard that the way to a man's heart was through his stomach, and it looked like Edaline was certainly working her way inside his heart. "Sure, you like it." "Do I like it? What do you think? I've been a month in Los Angeles and only had hamburgers and stuff like that." Edaline giggled. "Just a minute then." Jonah plopped in one of the easy chairs and stared at a painting that hung next to the television. It was Amish. It portrayed a buggy riding through green fields full of poppies and dandelions. "Where did you get the painting?" Jonah wanted to know. Edaline returned with Christopher, who was all cleaned up. She looked at the painting and sighed. "That's where I was born. But we'll talk about that later. First, let me get you your pot pie." Jonah smiled to himself. It was different here. A television, a fridge, but he felt at home. Still, he knew it had nothing to do with the appliances, but everything to do with that mysterious girl that had walked into his life just like that. After Edaline had put Christopher to bed and Jonah had made himself useful by doing the dishes after the delicious pot-pie, they sank into the 2 easy chairs. Edeline had prepared some sunset punch, and Jonah sure appreciated the effort. He smiled broadly at her while he sipped his drink. "Feels like home," he said. She smiled back, but her face was serious. "Tell me about you," she asked. "What's Rumspringa to you?" "What is there to say?" Jonah shrugged his shoulders. "To be honest, I never wanted to have a Rumspringa. I've got some good friends back home that are having Rumspringa, but all they are interested in is exploring the world and having fun." "And you don't?" Edaline raised her eyebrows. "No, not really," Jonah hesitated. "Of course I want to have fun, but that's not the point. I believe in Gott. I already know what I want to do with my life. I want to serve Gott. It's just that I... "What?" Edaline questioned. "Well, sometimes I feel we live such sheltered lives. There are people out in the world that need Gott too. Good people, Englishers, but sometimes I feel we are restricted in our abilities to help these people." Jonah glanced at Edaline and wondered if she would understand. "I wanted to come here, to Los Angeles, to see if I could find answers to these questions. That's why I am on my Rumspringa." He studied Edaline's face. "I really came here because of you." The thought sounded loud and clear in his head, but he couldn't tell her that. Not yet. For a moment, they were silent. Then Edaline's green eyes softened. "That's why you are on your Rumspringa? Ja? Do you think that is strange?" She shook her head. A faint smile lit her pale face. "No, on the contrary. I think it's beautiful." Beautiful. Jonah wanted to take her hand. He wanted to shout out that she was beautiful, that he had dreamed about her. He wanted to hold her and place a gentle kiss on her forehead, but he had to go slow, otherwise he would ruin everything. Edaline lifted her eyes as she softly spoke again. "Is it the rules of the Ordnung that made you feel that way? I always felt that these rules would squelch our personality and force us into a mold that maybe we are not meant to be in." Jonah pondered her words. "I believe in the Ordnung," he finally said. "Rules are good as long as you believe in them and understand why they are in place. But I suppose you are partly right, and that's what I wanted to find out." He reached out and placed his hand gently on Edaline's arm. For a moment, she stiffened and Jonah pulled back. "Did you leave the community because you felt you couldn't be yourself?" Jonah lowered his voice and tried to speak as gently as he could. She gave him a quick nod but didn't say anything. "Go on," Jonah coaxed. Edaline swallowed. "Well, for example, one of my brothers wanted to play music, but he wasn't allowed to do that. He left the Amish long before I did. Now he's playing in a band, and he's happy." "Well, if he is happy, then it's not bad, is it?" Jonah answered slowly. "Isn't that the real reason for Rumspringa? People who don't feel called to live the Amish life shouldn't be forced to live the Amish life. As I said before, obeying the rules isn't so hard if you know why you are doing it, and when you know that love is the pay." Edaline pinched her lips and was fighting back her tears again. "Where's your brother now?" Jonah wanted to know. "New York. I haven't seen him for more than 3 years." Her voice now had an element of harshness in it, and she narrowed her eyes. Then she shook her head and said, "I don't want to talk about it anymore, Jonah. You should go now. It's getting late, and tomorrow I have a long day." Jonah blinked his eyes. It almost seemed as if a chill had entered the room. Had he offended her? It was indeed getting late, but he couldn't leave like this. "Can I see you again, Edaline?" She hesitated as she looked into his longing eyes. "I know where you work, Jonah. Maybe I will hop in again for a cup of coffee. Maybe I won't. I'd like to see you again, Edaline." She did not respond. She had a vacant look in her eyes. Jonah nodded. "Sure." "Bye, Edaline. Thanks for the dinner. It's been lovely talking to you." When the door closed behind him and Jonah stood in the semi-darkness of the landing, he sighed. He needed to be so very careful with Edeline's broken heart. As he descended the stairs, he became acutely aware of how lonely he was since arriving in Los Angeles. The stale air of the building, a strange mixture of mold and cooking smells coming from the other apartments, made him long for the vast cornfields of the farm. When he got outside, rain was pouring down. He squeezed his hat tighter over his ears and stepped out onto the shimmering pavement of the street. "Oh God, please hold my hand. I feel so incapable of doing anything right." After Jonah had left, Edaline stared at the door for a long time as she replayed their conversations in her mind again and again. She had to admit it had been a good evening. But in the end, she had wanted to stop it. She couldn't let Jonah come too close. Besides, it was just too painful to talk about some of these things. He was so easy to talk to. It was almost as if he knew how to effortlessly draw out all her secrets. But she couldn't let that happen. When he had asked her about her brother, her chest had tightened. The door to her heart had swung wide open. Her loneliness grinned at her like an evil black beast that had been released of its chains. The joy of the evening had been pushed out by a beginning headache, and she had asked him to leave. Would she see him again? She grimaced. She didn't know. He seemed like such a gentle young man, so sincere and sweet, and he had made her feel like he actually cared. And yet, too much had happened. She had made such a mess of things. Edaline looked up and considered praying. Then she shook her head and got up. God wouldn't hear her. She heard the sharp words again the bishop had spoken to her the day she left. "The soul that sinneth, it shall die." She had laughed at his words, but now she wasn't laughing anymore. They had been true, so very true. A tear formed in Edeline's eyes and fell on her lap. At least she still had Christopher. He was all she still had, but he sure made her life worth living. Chapter 9. Love Never Fails. Edaline didn't show up in the Eager Beaver for several days. Jonah, however, was very busy and hardly had time to think about her, at least not during the day. At night, his thoughts would drift back relentlessly to the pale-faced girl with her beautiful green eyes. Then one day he even had a long conversation with an older man who seemed sincerely interested in the Amish and had lots of questions about God. It filled Jonah with joy. He had been right. Many Englishers were hungry for truth and faith, in spite of the darkness that hung over the city like a smoldering blanket. Just like in his dream, God was at work, but the talk had made him painfully aware again of Edaline. Would she still come back to see him? Maybe he just needed to go to her apartment again. Then, just as he was pondering what to do, the door opened again, and Edaline stepped in. Her eyes were searching the place, and when she saw Jonah, she smiled. "There's your friend, Jonah. Gilbert narrowed his eyes. Remember? Edaline. He walked over to her with outstretched arms. I am so very happy to see you. She pulled at the collar of her coat and pushed her hair back over her shoulder. Christopher and I. Would you come over for dinner again tonight? I made a hearty jackpot casserole, but it's no fun eating it by myself. I would love to, said Jonah, while he tried to suppress a grin. She was wearing a long, flowing blue Amish dress. Not at all what you would expect in Los Angeles, but Jonah loved it, and he wanted nothing more than to walk out the door with her into the sunset, right that minute, and never return to the eager beaver. I will see you then after 6. Edaline blushed as she turned around and left. After dinner, and when Christopher was back to bed, they were sitting again in the lazy chairs sipping sunset punch. Jonah had read stories to Christopher, and the little one had been roaring with laughter as Jonah was imitating all the different animals they were reading about. Christopher took an obvious liking to Jonah, and it felt good to Jonah to play the father role. But now it was time for other issues. Tonight, Jonah wanted to tell Edaline about his dream. He had decided that he would be completely open. He had to be honest, come what may. After all, if this was God's doing, there was no need to cover anything up. I was worrying that you did not want to see me anymore, he began. She lowered her eyes and seemed to be staring at her shoes. Then she straightened some folds in her dress and shook her head. No, Jonah, it wasn't that. You have been so kind. It's just that. Well, these last years haven't been very easy for me. Jonah nodded. I want to tell you something. You remember I told you a few days ago that I saw you before? Edaline nodded. Sure, you told me I reminded you of someone. Well, that wasn't exactly true. I actually did meet you before. Edaline blushed and raised her eyebrows. Where? He swallowed. In a dream. In a dream. You are joking, right? Jonah shook his head. No. I saw you in a dream. You were, you were pleading for help. I saw your eyes so clearly. I would recognize you out of 1,000 girls. I wasn't on my Rumspringa then, but after seeing you in that dream, I felt Gott was leading me to come to Los Angeles. Of course, I didn't know why. Jonah stopped and then whispered, but now I do know why. It was because I was to meet you. When he spoke, the color drained out of her face. To Jonah, she looked just like he had seen her in the dream, with her wavy hair over her sagging shoulders and those sad green eyes that spoke of misery and pain. Then tears formed in her eyes. Big drops fell on her lap as she softly sobbed. Jonah got up and knelt down at her chair. It's all right, Edeline. God loves you. I don't know, stammered Edaline. I felt God so much. I don't see how he can still love me. Tell me, Jonah coaxed. Edaline leaned forward and grabbed Jonah's hands and looked at him with her tear-stained face. Jonah wanted nothing more than to take that face in his hands and kiss all the hurt away. You really want to hear? Of course, dear Edaline. Of course I do. The door to Jonah's heart had been opened wide. Streams of love and concern were flowing out. He had never even known he was capable of such feelings. Tell me. About 2 years ago, sobbed Edaline, I was very rebellious. I hated life in the Amish. I hated the rules. I wanted freedom, and when it was time for my Rumspringa, I decided to get the best out of it. She shuddered as she relived her past experiences. I went to parties in town. I drank and smoked with the Englishers. Father and Ma'am were horrified. I hurt them so much. Then I met Bill. Jonah pulled Edaline close to his chest and listened with bated breath. Bill was a biker. He had an apartment here in Los Angeles. When I told him how much I hated life in the Amish, he laughed and said he had the solution. He put me on his motorcycle, and we drove here. He's Christopher's father. Jonah gave a gasp. He is. Where is he now? He is gone. When he found out I was pregnant, he dragged me to an abortion clinic. He said he didn't want a self-righteous Amish kid for a child, but I fought him. I kicked and screamed so the people in the abortion clinic didn't want to help me more. Then at home, Bill got drunk and started to kick and beat me. In his drunken stupor, he yelled that he would abort the child himself if the clinic wouldn't do it. Jonah squeezed his eyes shut. He couldn't believe what he heard and what this monster had done to this precious woman. He started to caress her wavy hair, and a tear now formed in his own eye. Gott, what horrors there are in this world! Bill needs to be brought to justice. Edaline shook her head. I don't ever want to see him again. And his beatings didn't work. She smiled through her tears. Christopher was born healthy. He's the best thing in my life. What happened then? Jonah whispered. Bill threw me out. I stayed in a shelter for homeless women for a month or two, and then I found a job and I got myself this little place. Oh, Edaline. Sweet Edaline. Jonah gently kissed her forehead. I am so glad I met you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jonah asked, Why didn't you go home? Your parents would have taken you in. They love you and would have forgiven you. A wave of fresh tears overcame her. I've hurt them so much, I can't face them anymore. I've lost my right to be a respectable member at their table. Jonah's eyes flashed. That is nonsense. What do you think the father of the prodigal son must have felt? I don't know your parents, but if they are true Amish, they are yearning for you every minute of every day. She looked up into Jonah's face. I've been so far away from Gott, but I'm ready to return. I have prayed so many desperate prayers, but did not dare to trust that Gott still loved me. But now you told me you dreamed about me. Her voice broke again. That Gott really cares that much? You think he still loves me? Oh, Edaline. Jonah simply said while he kissed her again on her hair. Of course he still loves you. Now I understand all my trials from the past 2 months. Now I know why Gott was so forceful in getting me to obey. Edaline, it is so wonderful. God is so Gott. She rested her face on Jonah's chest, and although Jonah was getting extremely uncomfortable on the floor in front of the easy chair, he did not want to break the spell of the moment and stubbornly kept sitting in his painful position. Luckily for him, Edaline herself decided to move and serve them some more sunset punch, so Jonah could stretch his painful legs in relief. Thank you, Gott, it was worth it all. That night, they talked for hours and hours. We're going to be awfully tired at work today, Jonah said at the first pink of dawn. In a few hours, he had to be back at the Eager Beaver, and Edaline would have to bring Christopher to the daycare center and go to her own work. I know, smiled Edeline, but I don't care. This has been the best night in a very, very long time. Jonah smiled back. I agree. I hope this is the beginning of a real friendship. Edeline's eyes shone with hope and sparkled with life. "Jonah," she said while she leaned forward, "you came all the way to Los Angeles to find a girl like me. I am not about to let you slip away from me." Jonah blushed. "I." But before he could finish his sentence, Edaline placed a gentle kiss on Jonah's lips. Chapter 10. Epilogue. 2 months later, Jonah was back on the train. But this time he was no longer alone. Edaline sat next to him and looked radiant. Christopher was sitting on Jonah's lap and was pointing to all the different scenes and sights he saw. "Horsey! Jonah!" he shouted in excitement, at one point when he saw an old workhorse near a barn while the train sped by. Jonah smiled. He loved that kid. Christopher was part of Edaline, and as far as Jonah was concerned, that was all that mattered. It felt good to be going home with both Edaline and Christopher. He had not wanted to push her into anything she did not want to do, but he missed home, and since he really didn't like the big city, he had brought up the subject one day. "Can I ask you something?" he asked while sipping his rhubarb punch. "Sure. What is it?" "Well, I know we've only known each other a short while." He stopped for a moment and searched for the right words. There is still so much to do and to discuss. But, will you consider going back with me to my community? He bit his lip. Would she want to? He had prayed for it fervently. "You see, I don't really want to live in Los Angeles. I believe you were the sole reason God sent me here, but now that I found you..." There was a twinkle in Edeline's eyes. She had been like a dying flower, but had been brought back to life through the love and hope she had received through Jonah's presence. Jonah could hardly believe she was the same girl he had first met in his dream, and he counted himself the richest man on earth. "Jonah Yoder," she interrupted slowly and deliberately, "I feel unworthy of the honor you bestow upon me. Of course, I want to go with you. If your community has a place for me, I would want nothing more than to do just that. I think I would even go to the ends of the world with you. And since God is so gracious and big that he was willing to send one of his children into a dirty city like Los Angeles, just to help me, I will yield to any rule he has for me." Then she kissed Jonah passionately, and here they were on the train. In a little while, they would arrive. Father and Ma'am would be at the train station. Jonah had written to them explaining everything in detail, and they were overjoyed to have Edaline and Christopher join the farm for now. In a flash, he saw his friend Zach again, and how he had run alongside the departing train. What was it again that he had said? "Jonah, kiss all the girls for me," Jonah chuckled. "No, Zach, this girl I kiss for myself." There were the woods again that he had explored as a kid, and there was the farm of the Zooks. "God, you've been so good to me." Jonah looked at Edaline and smiled. "Welcome back to the world of beauty and peace, Edaline," he said with a yearning look. "To be coming here with you is making me of all people most blessed." She smiled back at him and said gently, "That can't be true, Jonah Yoder." "For that would be me." The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.